Racist cop tries to remove black woman from court. Panics when the White House calls her mid-trial. Ma'am, you need to leave now. The officer's sharp command sliced through the heavy tension in the room. Natalie Vaughn stood her ground, clutching her legal documents as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I have the right to be here, she said, her voice unwavering, her stance resolute. The judge's gavel struck down. Not anymore. Bailiff, remove her. Sergeant Damon Whitmore stepped forward, prepared to escort her out. Just as he reached for her, the courtroom doors burst open. A breathless clerk rushed in, waving a folded note. Your Honor, she gasped, voice trembling. There's a call from the White House. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The judge froze. The officer halted mid-step. And in that moment, Natalie knew everything was about to change. Before we unravel this jaw-dropping twist, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you love shocking true stories, don't forget to subscribe. The calm before the storm. Rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets over a quiet DC suburb, turning driveways into silver mirrors and trees into black silhouettes swaying with silent urgency. Inside a modest brick townhouse, nestled between two towering maples, Natalie Vaughn stood at her kitchen window, watching the raindrops trickle down the glass. Behind her, the kettle hissed, but she didn't move. She was too focused, too still. Today wasn't just another court date. It was the day she would stand up to the corporation that had tried to erase her, to silence the truth. She had barely slept. Her mind spun with timelines, email threads, legal strategies, and the faces of those who had doubted her for far too long. On the table behind her sat a meticulously organized binder of evidence, its corners worn from constant handling. Above it, a framed photo of Natalie and her daughter, Maya, beamed under a golden summer sun, a reminder of what was truly at stake. Nervous, Maya's voice came from the doorway, wrapped in her favorite hoodie, a tablet tucked under her arm. She studied her mother carefully. She was only 13, but sharp, too sharp sometimes. Natalie turned and managed a small smile, pushing past the weight in her chest. More than I want to admit, she confessed, reaching for her coffee mug. But we've come too far to stop now. Maya patted over and held out a small object, a tarnished pendant in the shape of a feather. For luck, she said. Grandma always said feathers carry the weight of truth, even when no one listens. Natalie's breath caught. The pendant had once been hers, passed down from her own mother, a civil rights organizer who had taught her to speak up, even when her voice trembled. She clutched it tightly. Thank you, baby. I'll carry it with me. Outside, the storm intensified. Thunder rumbled like distant judgment as Natalie pulled on her raincoat and stepped into the gray morning. The sky felt heavy, pressing down like an unspoken warning. The drive to the courthouse was tense. Windshield wipers sliced rhythmically through the downpour. She passed the gleaming headquarters of Arento Strategies, the political consulting firm that had fired her a year earlier under the guise of restructuring. But she knew the truth. She had uncovered a pattern of racially biased messaging strategies buried in internal campaigns. When she brought it up, they dismissed her both literally and figuratively. Now she was taking them to court. As the courthouse came into view, she noticed a growing crowd of reporters huddled under umbrellas. Word had spread. People knew her case wasn't just about one woman fighting back. It was about exposing an entire system. She parked, took a final steadying breath, and stepped into the rain, gripping her binder like a shield. At the courthouse entrance, a flash of lightning illuminated a lone figure waiting by the doors, Sergeant Damon Whitmore. His expression unreadable. There was no mistaking it. He had been waiting for her. A chill crawled up Natalie's spine. For a split second, she hesitated. Not just because of what she was walking into, but because of who might be working from the inside to shut her down. The storm, it seemed, was only just beginning. Inside the lion's den, the courthouse loomed, cold and unyielding, its granite columns slick with rain. The flags outside snapped in the wind like distant warnings. Natalie stood at the curb, staring up at the building that would decide her fate. Would her voice finally be heard? Or would it be silenced again? She tightened her coat, rain streaking down her cheeks like the echoes of old tears. Around her, the city continued its usual chaos. Horns blaring, pedestrians rushing under umbrellas. But for Natalie, everything felt muted, as if the entire world had dimmed, sharpening the focus on this one defining moment. She inhaled deeply, braced herself, and stepped forward. The security checkpoint was tenser than usual. Uniformed officers stood flanking the metal detectors, their eyes scanning the crowd with heightened scrutiny. Natalie didn't need to be told. They were waiting for her. Their eyes scanned every face that entered. Rumors had spread online that a federal corruption case involving a sitting senator was being heard in the same building that day. But Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that the extra scrutiny had little to do with that. She felt the weight of every lingering gaze, each one holding a question, an unspoken judgment. She wasn't just another litigant walking through those doors. Her case had already sparked quiet controversy, the kind that made powerful people sweat behind closed doors. She approached the security checkpoint, gripping her evidence binder so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. A young officer motioned her forward without a word. But just as she started unloading her bag, another voice cut through the air. "Hold up, I'll take this one." The officer stepped aside as Sergeant Damon Whitmore approached. His presence was both commanding and unsettling. Broad-shouldered, impeccably groomed, he moved like a man accustomed to being obeyed. His gaze locked onto Natalie, cool, professional, unreadable. "You're Ms. Vaughn," he stated rather than asked. Natalie didn't flinch. "I am." Whitmore nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to the binder in her hands. "You're here for room 4B. Judge Sinclair," she replied, keeping her voice steady, even as a cold dread curled around her spine. A bead of silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. There was something in Whitmore's stance, the way his hand rested near his holstered belt, that felt less like security and more like surveillance. He wasn't just ensuring order. He was anticipating trouble. "Follow the signs to the elevators," he finally said, stepping aside. "Courtrooms on the 3rd floor." Natalie nodded, stepping past him. But as she did, she caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition? Caution? Or worse, an unspoken warning? Inside the courthouse. The courthouse was a maze of marble and murmurs. Attorneys whispered urgently into phones. Clerks hurried between chambers, and digital screens displayed courtroom schedules like a train station departures board. Inside the elevator, Natalie found herself alone, staring at her reflection in the brushed metal walls. Her pendant, her mother's old feather charm, glinted softly against her blouse. She touched it for strength just as the doors slid open with a hollow ding. The 3rd floor was quieter. Too quiet. The hallway leading to room 4B stretched ahead, long and sterile, humming faintly under fluorescent lights. Each step she took echoed a little too loudly. She could feel eyes on her, watching, waiting. Just as she reached the heavy wooden doors, they creaked open from the inside. Travis Monroe, her attorney, stepped out. His face was tense, but when he saw her, it softened with a mixture of relief and urgency. "You're right on time," he said, "but something's off." Natalie frowned. "They moved up the schedule?" "No explanation," he muttered. "You think they're trying to rush it?" Travis didn't answer. Instead, he simply motioned her inside. "Whatever it is," he murmured under his breath, "we need to be ready." Taking a steadying breath, Natalie stepped into the courtroom, unaware that the day would unfold in ways no one expected. A courtroom like no other. The air inside room 4B was thick with tension, a stillness that hummed beneath the surface. Dark-paneled walls loomed overhead, and long wooden benches gleamed under the recessed lights, like pews in a chapel built not for prayer, but for judgment. Natalie's heels clicked against the polished floor, a rhythmic countdown to something irreversible. At the front of the room, beneath the state crest and 2 crossed flags, Judge Margot Sinclair was already seated, already watching. Sinclair had a reputation elegant, severe, sharp as shattered glass. She was known throughout DC's legal circles for her intolerance of theatrics and her notoriously short fuse. Her high-collared robe framed a face of stone. Her silver-streaked hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked like it could snap. She didn't lean back. She sat upright, still as a statue, gavel already in hand, as if daring someone to make her use it. Natalie swallowed hard as their eyes met. The judge's scrutiny was suffocating. Not curiosity, not even skepticism. Calculation, appraisal. Travis moved quickly to the plaintiff's table and whispered, "Don't let her demeanor shake you. Stick to what we rehearsed." Natalie nodded but didn't reply. She couldn't take her eyes off Sinclair. Something about the judge's gaze unsettled her. It wasn't just the authority she carried. It was colder than that, more personal. On the other side of the room, the opposing counsel sat poised. A man in a perfectly tailored suit, his slicked-back hair giving him the air of a predator who had already scented victory. He exuded confidence, the kind that came from knowing the game was rigged in his favor. Natalie had seen that look before, in boardrooms, in performance reviews, in the smug smirks of men who dismissed her without a second thought. The throat cleared, a single, sharp sound that cut through the room like a scalpel. "Court is now in session," Judge Sinclair announced, her voice crisp, emotionless. "Mr. Monroe, you may proceed with your opening statement." Travis stood, adjusting his suit as he stepped forward. His voice was steady as he laid out the framework of Natalie's case, outlining her wrongful termination and the disturbing pattern of racial bias within Arento strategies. The room listened, but Natalie could feel it. Something wasn't right. The judge barely reacted. Her pen moved across her notepad in precise, clinical strokes. No questions, no interruptions, just a slow, deliberate narrowing of her eyes. When Travis mentioned the encrypted internal emails Natalie had uncovered, suggesting that racial profiling wasn't just a side effect of Arento's political strategies, but a core part of their model, Sinclair's grip on her pen tightened ever so slightly. When Natalie finally took the stand, it felt like stepping into a lion's den. She started off calmly, detailing her job performance, her discoveries, and the discriminatory practices she had unearthed. But as she began naming specific individuals, citing internal policies, and referencing critical documents, the judge's demeanor shifted. A flicker of impatience, a glance toward the bailiff. The opposing counsel objected repeatedly, and each time, Sinclair sustained it without hesitation. Then, just as Natalie prepared to submit her most damning evidence, a data trail linking Arento's policy shifts directly to internal racial profiling memos, Judge Sinclair raised a hand. "You've made your point, Miss Vaughn," she said coolly. "Let's not turn this courtroom into a crusade." The words hit like ice. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Natalie froze. Travis opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Sinclair's gavel cracked sharply against the bench. "One more outburst or deviation from protocol," she warned, her tone like steel, "and I will have you removed." The air thickened. Natalie felt it, the ground shifting beneath her case. And something else. A creeping certainty that someone, somewhere, wanted her silenced before she got any closer to the truth. The walls were closing in. In. With every sustained objection. Every pointed look from Judge Margot Sinclair. Every smirk from opposing counsel that suggested he already knew how this was going to end. She sat upright on the witness stand, hands folded over the edge, her voice steady but threaded with quiet urgency. Her testimony had started with careful composure, but now, as she attempted to introduce the crucial new evidence, a series of internal emails leaked just days earlier. Everything teetered on the brink. She held up the printed copies, each page laced with veiled language about image concerns, urban optics, and other coded phrases used to justify freezing her out of leadership roles. Pages that could dismantle Arento Strategies' entire defense. Pages that had already begun circulating among journalists and watchdog groups, anonymously. But here, in this courtroom, they didn't officially exist. Not unless the judge allowed them in. "I'm asking the court to review these documents," Natalie said, lifting them slightly. "They were obtained legally, and they are directly relevant to—" "That's enough, Miss Vaughn," Judge Sinclair interrupted sharply, her eyes narrowing. "We've already heard your testimony. But, Your Honor," Travis Monroe stood quickly, his tone still respectful but firm. This evidence only came to light this week. We're prepared to authenticate. I said enough, Sinclair snapped. The gavel slammed down with such force that the sound cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Gasps rippled through the gallery. But Natalie remained still. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she held her ground. I have the right to present a full defense, she said, her voice rising for the first time. Not if you continue to violate courtroom procedure. The judge's tone was ice cold. She turned to the bailiff and then nodded toward the back of the room. Remove her from the courtroom. For a moment, time stopped. Natalie's blood ran cold as she watched Sergeant Damon Whitmore step forward. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid, pure authority and protocol. He moved with careful precision, his presence suddenly immense. Ma'am, he said quietly but firmly, you need to come with me. Travis sprang to his feet. Your Honor, please, this is an overreaction. My client is under immense pressure. She meant no disrespect. Judge Sinclair didn't respond. She simply tapped her gavel again and looked away, as if she had already dismissed Natalie Vaughn from existence. Natalie rose slowly, clutching her binder to her chest like a shield, wrapping herself in frayed professionalism. Whitmore's hand landed on her arm, gentle but firm. A small gesture, but one that carried the weight of centuries. As she was led down the aisle, murmurs broke out. Some whispered in sympathy. Others leaned back, smug and satisfied. To them, she had overstepped. She had become too emotional, too assertive. Natalie's heart pounded with fury and fear. She wasn't being removed because she had disrupted the court. She was being removed because she had gotten too close. The storm outside still raged, and inside something far more dangerous had just been set into motion. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her with a cold, final thud, and Natalie Vaughn found herself standing alone in the sterile, too bright hallway of the courthouse, exiled from the very space where she had come to demand justice. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from sheer, unshakable indignation. The binder in her arms felt heavier now, like a coffin for all the truths she had fought to bring into the light. Her shoulders sagged, but she refused to let the tears burning behind her eyes fall. Not here, not where they could see, not where they could win. She moved toward a bench tucked into the far corner near the frosted glass windows, the world outside blurred by rain and judgment. The hallway buzzed with distant voices, the muffled clatter of shoes against marble. But no one acknowledged her. She might as well have been invisible, a woman erased in plain sight. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps, sharp, deliberate, cut through the quiet. Sergeant Damon Whitmore appeared at the end of the corridor, clipboard in hand, his boots striking the floor like a metronome of authority. Natalie stiffened instinctively as he approached. For a long, tense moment, he said nothing. Then, in a tone just slightly less rigid than before, he spoke. Look, he said, glancing around before meeting her eyes. You put me in a difficult position. Sergeant Damon Whitmore's voice was measured, his expression neutral. The judge gave an order. I followed it. Natalie lifted her eyes to him slowly. You didn't have to grab me like I was a threat, she said, her voice steady but ice cold. I'm not a criminal, Sergeant. Whitmore's jaw tightened, and for the briefest moment, something like regret flickered across his face. I don't make the rules, he muttered, his gaze shifting away. I just enforce them. Then maybe you should ask yourself what kind of rules you're helping enforce. Her words were sharp, precise, and though Whitmore didn't respond, his silence spoke volumes. The moment stretched between them. Natalie turned away, gripping the binder tighter, her heart aching. Not just from the humiliation of being ejected from her own hearing, but from the suffocating realization that the system had never been designed to hear her at all. She had played by every rule, followed every procedure, prepared every document down to the comma, and still it hadn't been enough. One moment of passion, one step outside the carefully drawn lines, and she was cast out as disruptive. Minutes dragged by like hours. Her phone buzzed, but it wasn't Travis. No updates, No rescue, just silence on the other end of justice. She tried to retrace her steps, to pinpoint what she could have done differently, but deep down, she already knew. This wasn't about decorum. It was about silencing a woman who had gotten too close to a truth certain people wanted buried. The door at the far end of the hall opened. A court clerk hurried past, oblivious to her presence, like she was nothing more than a shadow against the bench. And yet, the weight of humiliation remained, pressing into her ribs like a vice. Still, she sat upright. She would not leave. She would not run, because something deep inside whispered that this story wasn't over yet. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere had shifted from controlled tension to barely concealed chaos. Travis Monroe stood alone at the plaintiff's table, his eyes burning with anger, his voice taut with urgency as he addressed Judge Margot Sinclair. "Your Honor, suppressing this evidence isn't just unjust. It may be unlawful." His voice rang through the silent chamber, each word landing like a challenge at the judge's feet. "My client's entire case hinges on these documents, which establish a clear, deliberate pattern of racial bias. You've denied her the right to present them." Judge Sinclair didn't respond immediately. Her expression remained unreadable as she adjusted her glasses and shuffled papers, giving no indication that she was moved or even listening. Across the room, the opposing counsel leaned back in his chair, exuding smug satisfaction. His pen tapped rhythmically against his notepad, a slow, deliberate beat, as if marking time until this all faded away. But before Sinclair could bang her gavel again and reassert control, the courtroom doors burst open. Every head turned. A court clerk, face flushed and breath unsteady, strode quickly to the bench, clutching an envelope sealed in red wax. She leaned in, whispering something urgently into the judge's ear. Sinclair's brow twitched. Her body stiffened. Whatever she had just heard did not sit well. "This is highly irregular," she muttered, her voice tight with suspicion. "Where did this come from?" The clerk whispered again, glancing nervously around the courtroom. "Direct from the Federal Circuit, Lazison's office. There's a call waiting on the secure line from the Department of Justice." The words sent a ripple through the room. A hushed murmur spread among the observers and legal aides. For the first time that morning, the smug confidence on the opposing counsel's face faltered. Travis's pulse jumped. Something seismic was happening. Sinclair stood abruptly, folding the envelope with stiff fingers. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes, she announced, her voice clipped, her usual composure noticeably shaken. "All parties are to remain in the vicinity." She gathered her robes and swept toward her chambers, her gavel striking the bench with a force that echoed like a cannon blast. The moment she disappeared behind the heavy wooden door, the courtroom erupted into whispered speculation. "What kind of call?" a clerk murmured. "Did someone from the White House intervene?" a junior associate asked in hushed disbelief. Travis remained at the table, motionless, his mind racing. The DOJ, the Federal Circuit. Had someone at the national level taken notice of Natalie's case? Had the documents already made their way further up the ladder than they had realized? His eyes flicked to the empty seat where Natalie should have been. His fists clenched. Whatever was unfolding behind those closed doors, it was no longer just about courtroom politics. Justice, for once, might finally be running out of patience. Behind the tall oak door of her chambers, Judge Margot Sinclair stood rigidly at her desk, staring down at the secure landline as if it were a venomous snake. The call had come within moments of the envelope's arrival, directly from the Deputy Attorney General's office. Now, as she listened to the clipped, low voice on the other end, the carefully maintained mask of judicial detachment began to crack. Her spine straightened, her lips pressed into a tight line. She murmured a series of respectful "Yes, sir. Understood. I will comply." Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the receiver. Across the room, Sergeant Damon Whitmore stood silently. He had been summoned minutes earlier by a rattled court clerk, expecting nothing more than a routine disciplinary update, perhaps a follow-up on Natalie Vaughn's removal. But now, standing in the wood-paneled chamber, surrounded by the scent of old law books and something far more suffocating, He understood. This was much bigger than he had anticipated. Judge Sinclair finally set the phone down, moving as if the weight of it had doubled in her hands. A heavy silence lingered in the room before Judge Sinclair looked up, her eyes softer than before, now clouded by something Whitmore hadn't seen in her before, unease. "That was the Department of Justice," she said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "The Deputy Attorney General himself." Whitmore blinked, barely masking his surprise. "About the Vaughn case?" "Yes." Sinclair paused, carefully considering her words. "It seems Miss Vaughn's removal from the courtroom has attracted attention at the highest levels. Someone very senior has taken an interest. The DOJ is sending a liaison to oversee the rest of the hearing." She crossed the room, pulling Natalie's file from her desk and flipping through the pages without really reading them. Her tone lowered again, quieter. "They were clear. If it appears that this court has acted to suppress valid claims of racial discrimination or retaliated against a plaintiff for asserting their rights, there will be consequences." The words hung in the air, sharp and ominous, like a match dropped in dry grass. Whitmore folded his arms. "What do you want me to do?" Her gaze met his, sharp again but less certain. "Find Miss Vaughn. Now, escort her back into the courtroom with respect. No cuffs, no hostility. Make it clear she is to be heard fully." A brief pause. "Sergeant, I don't need to remind you. This is no longer a routine hearing. There are eyes on this now, powerful eyes. The kind that don't forget." Whitmore nodded stiffly, but internally, he was shaken. Just this morning, Natalie Vaughn had been treated as a courtroom disturbance, a liability. Now, she was a plaintiff with the Department of Justice behind her. As he left the chambers, his boots echoing through the marble corridor, he couldn't shake the feeling that the tide had shifted, swift, unexpected, and possibly unstoppable. Whatever this case had stirred, it was no longer just about one woman's testimony. It was about the system itself, and the system had been caught looking away. The corridor stretched ahead of Sergeant Damon Whitmore like a gauntlet. Polished floors, watchful stairs, and walls that now seemed too narrow to hold the weight of the moment. The judge's words echoed in his mind like distant thunder. "Escort Miss Vaughn back with respect." He had heard his share of courtroom politics over the years, but never had he been ordered to reverse course under pressure from the Department of Justice, and certainly not for someone like Natalie Vaughn, a woman he had just forcibly removed under Gavelruck orders. He hadn't expected to think twice about it, but now the stakes had changed, and so had she. He found her exactly where he left her, sitting alone near the hallway exit. Her binder was still clutched in her lap, her posture straight despite the storm she'd just endured. Her eyes flicked up as he approached, unreadable but steady. She didn't flinch, didn't rise, just waited. Her calm unnerved him more than any courtroom outburst. Whitmore stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware of how he must look, how he had looked when he loomed over her earlier, hand on her arm like she was some threat. He cleared his throat, uncertain for the first time in a long time. "Miss Vaughn," he said, quieter than before. "You're being asked to return to the courtroom." She blinked. "Asked?" Her voice was cool, not mocking, more like testing the truth in his tone. He nodded once. "Judge Sinclair wants you back. The hearing's resuming. Full testimony, full evidence." She didn't move, and he didn't blame her. The last time she stood, it was to be dragged out. "What changed?" she asked, brow raised. Whitmore hesitated, weighing what he could say. The official version, the sanitized one, or something closer to the truth. "There's been interest from higher up," he said finally. "Washington, the DOJ. Your case isn't just yours anymore." Natalie stared at him, eyes narrowing. "So now I'm worth listening to?" He looked away briefly. "I didn't see the whole picture earlier," he admitted. "I saw someone pushing back, and I was trained to respond. But that doesn't make it right." Silence stretched between them again, this time heavier. Finally, she rose, still holding her binder, still composed. "Then let's go," she said. "But know this, Sergeant. Respect isn't something you get to offer when it's convenient. It's something you should have had from the beginning." He nodded, absorbing the words like a bruise. Understood. As they walked side by side through the hallway, past curious stares and quiet whispers, Whitmore felt a shift in his own steps. Something was unraveling, not just the case but the illusion he had clung to for years. That neutrality was safety, that following orders meant doing right. But now, as the elevator doors opened to return them to the courtroom, he understood something new. Sometimes justice demands more than obedience. It demands conscience. When Natalie Vaughn stepped back into courtroom 4B, the air felt different, charged, humming with a silent current of anticipation. The same space that had rejected her just an hour earlier now watched her with something closer to awe or maybe unease. The gallery, once half empty, was now quietly full. Word had spread. A White House-connected call. DOJ oversight. Something had shifted in the shadows of power, and Natalie could feel it in every glance, every tightened jaw. Sergeant Damon Whitmore escorted her to her table without a word, his demeanor far more solemn than before. As she sat, Travis Monroe leaned in with a hushed whisper, eyes wide with barely contained adrenaline. "They got spooked, huh?" he murmured. "That call hit hard. Sinclair's been briefed by the DOJ rep. He's in the building somewhere." Natalie blinked, absorbing the whiplash of it all. Moments ago, she had been walked out in humiliation. Now, she was being welcomed back like the center of a political firestorm. Her heart thudded, not just with anxiety, but with a strange flicker of hope. The truth might finally have room to breathe at the bench. Judge Margot Sinclair returned, her robe swaying behind her like a warning banner. She took her seat and adjusted her glasses with deliberate care, but something in her posture had shifted. No less composed, but noticeably less cold. She tapped her gavel once. "Let the record reflect that the court is resuming its hearing in Vaughn versus Arento Strategies," she announced. Her voice was steady, though slightly strained from recent developments. "This court has decided to allow the submission of new evidence that had been previously withheld." Gasps fluttered from the back of the room like wings. Natalie didn't exhale until she felt Travis gently place the binder on the table and slide it toward the judge. "Exhibits 14 through 27, Your Honor," he said with precision, "including internal correspondence, metadata logs, and performance evaluation comparisons." Opposing counsel stood immediately. "Your Honor, we object. These documents were not submitted through discovery. The court has already ruled." Sinclair cut him off. "Objection noted, but overruled. Proceed." It was a subtle moment, but profound. For the first time, Natalie had the full attention of the court. Travis began walking through the digital trail like a surgeon with a scalpel. The courtroom screens flickered to life, displaying emails laced with racially coded language, client fit, image alignment, and branding concerns that had been used to justify sidelining Natalie. The stark contrast between glowing performance reviews and the sudden downturn after a change in management spoke louder than any testimony. A hush fell so deep that even the click of a pen felt intrusive. Natalie sat upright, watching as her reality was finally being acknowledged in pixels and proof. Even Judge Sinclair, once unmoved, now scribbled notes rapidly. Opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, no longer smirking. The tide was turning, not with fire, but with facts. And in the quiet storm that followed, Natalie realized something powerful. They weren't just hearing her now. They were listening. The truth didn't arrive with thunder. It crept in quietly and undeniably, like smoke slipping under a locked door. As Travis Monroe clicked to the next slide, revealing a chain of internal memos unearthed just days ago, the atmosphere in the courtroom curdled from tension to alarm. On screen were damning lines from corporate correspondents at Arento Strategies, referring to campaign targets and using phrases like "avoid overly urban-facing staff" and "realign optics for voter compatibility." Though couched in coded language, the intent was unmistakable. This wasn't just about Natalie Vaughn's career. It was about a system that had profited from racial erasure. But Travis wasn't done. He walked to the evidence table and pulled out a folder, stamped confidential. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carefully measured, "this next piece of evidence comes from a whistleblower. an internal strategist from Arento who came forward after Miss Vaughn's removal from this courtroom earlier today. The judge's eyes narrowed. Name? She's appearing via secure video testimony under federal witness protection, Travis replied, due to safety concerns. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and the screen flickered to life. The image stabilized, revealing a woman in her late 20s with tired eyes and a strained expression. She wore no makeup, and her hair was hastily pulled back as if she'd rushed to record this the moment courage overcame fear. My name is Sabrina Navarro, she said. I worked on the senior communications team at Arento for 4 years. I saw the reports Natalie wrote. I saw the changes in how she was treated after speaking up. But I stayed silent until now. The courtroom hung on her every word. Sabrina outlined how Natalie's warnings about discriminatory practices were buried, how leadership retaliated by excluding her from key accounts, and how senior executives actively encouraged demographic targeting strategies that intentionally manipulated public perception by race and socioeconomic status. They framed it as smart campaigning, she said, her voice cracking. But it was calculated exclusion. Natalie wasn't fired because she underperformed. She was fired because she tried to stop it. Opposing counsel jumped to his feet. This is hearsay. There's no proof. Sit down, counselor, Judge Sinclair said sharply. Her gavel stayed untouched. Her glare was enough. Sabrina continued. When I heard Natalie was being silenced in court, I knew I had to speak up. What they're doing isn't just unethical. It's dangerous. As her testimony ended, the courtroom remained silent. No one moved. The weight of her words hung in the air like a blade, waiting to drop. Natalie sat motionless, stunned, not just by the validation but by the scale of what her case had uncovered. This wasn't just about one job. It wasn't even about one company. It was about a corporate structure built to quietly marginalize, manipulate, and maintain power. And now that truth, ugly, undeniable, and no longer hidden, was finally out in the open. The reckoning had begun. For a long moment after Sabrina Navarro's testimony faded from the screen, Courtroom 4B remained utterly silent, the kind of silence that signals a shift, not in tone but in power. Opposing counsel, once smug and unbothered, now sat rigid in his chair, his fingers frozen above his notepad, unsure whether to write or run. The color had drained from his face. The evidence was no longer just circumstantial or emotionally compelling. It was devastating. Natalie Vaughn's claims of racial bias were now reinforced by an insider with direct knowledge, damning memos, and the courage to defy the very machine she had once served. Across the room, Judge Margot Sinclair adjusted her glasses with more care than before. The sternness remained, but a deep, contemplative frown had taken hold. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers laced together beneath her chin, as though finally recognizing the magnitude of what had unfolded. In her courtroom, Judge Sinclair flipped through her notes, pausing over highlighted sections, and then glanced back up. Her eyes were sharper now, calculating. The balance had shifted, and everyone in the room could sense it. "Does the defense have any rebuttal?" she asked, her voice low and pointed, no longer perfunctory. The lead attorney for Arento Strategies rose slowly, as though the floor beneath him might collapse. His confidence was gone, replaced by a barely concealed panic. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat, "we request a brief recess to..." "To what?" Sinclair interjected. "To find an explanation for emails written by your client's executive board? Or to respond to a federal whistleblower who provided corroborating testimony under oath?" The lawyer's mouth opened and closed again. He swallowed hard. "We weren't aware of these materials until this morning. We would like time to verify their authenticity." Travis Monroe stood before the judge before she could speak. "All documents have been verified with matching metadata. Your Honor, the DOJ has copies. Every timestamp, every header, every IP address has been reviewed." Sinclair raised an eyebrow toward the defense table. "Still requesting a recess?" The opposing counsel nodded stiffly, his voice dry. "Yes, Your Honor. 30 minutes. "So ordered," she replied, banging her gavel once. Then, Pointedly, she added, "Use it wisely." As the courtroom emptied with a low hum of whispers and sideways glances, Natalie remained seated. Her body was still, but her mind raced. Everything was shifting. She could see it in the nervous way the defense huddled near the exit, whispering urgently. She could hear it in the rapid-fire clicks of reporters' phone keyboards. She could feel it, the crumbling of the wall she'd been pounding her fists against for months. Travis leaned in, barely containing a grin. They're cornered. The DOJ is watching, and public opinion just detonated in our favor. Natalie stared straight ahead, gripping the binder now more like a torch than a shield. For the first time since walking into that courtroom, she wasn't just defending herself. She was winning. Miles away from the courthouse, in a sleek, glass-paneled boardroom atop one of DC's most powerful high-rises, Arento Strategies was unraveling. The conference table, once a symbol of control and strategy, was now cluttered with coffee cups, scattered documents, and the unmistakable tension of corporate panic. CEO Elliot Granger, silver-haired and usually unflappable, stood at the head of the table, staring at the large screen on the wall. A live stream of Natalie Vaughn's case, which had now gone viral. A red banner from a national news outlet ran beneath the footage. DOJ eyes Arento Strategies in potential civil rights investigation. The silence in the room was broken only by the furious tapping of a legal advisor's laptop and the CEO's sharp intake of breath. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Granger muttered, his voice low and dangerous. She was a mid-level brand manager with a grievance, not a national headline. "She has proof," said Cynthia Marsh, the firm's head of communications, who looked far less composed than usual. "And now she has a whistleblower. Sabrina Navarro's testimony, it's out. It's everywhere." One of the junior executives dared to speak. "We could still issue a statement. Maybe call it a misunderstanding, company miscommunication, poor documentation. Something." "Stop," snapped the company's general counsel, slamming a hand on the table. "This is not a PR cleanup. This is a legal catastrophe. The DOJ is watching. The White House may be involved. And if those emails are admissible and authentic, we're looking at more than one lawsuit. We're looking at systemic discrimination investigations at the federal level, possibly class action." Granger ran a hand over his face, pacing now. "How the hell did this get past compliance? We've had complaints before, sure, but they've always been manageable." Cynthia nodded grimly. "Not anymore. Employees are speaking out on social media. One of our clients just pulled out of a major deal. Hashtag #IWorkedAtArento is trending on 3 platforms." Granger's jaw clenched. "Find out who else has NDAs. Lock them down." The general counsel shot him a look. "That's a terrible idea. If we're seen suppressing people now, it'll blow up even worse. We're being watched closely." "Then what do you suggest? Start negotiating. Apology, settlement, reforms, real ones. If we move fast, we might keep the DOJ from issuing a formal charge." Another executive leaned forward cautiously. "Do we think Vaughn wants a settlement? Or is she going all the way?" Everyone looked at each other. No one answered, because they all knew this wasn't just a lawsuit for Natalie Vaughn anymore. It was a reckoning. As panic thickened in the room like smoke, Granger sat down heavily in his leather chair. The mighty Arento brand, so careful, so powerful, so untouchable, was no longer behind closed doors. It was exposed, unraveled, and losing credibility by the hour. One thing was clear. Natalie Vaughn hadn't just threatened their bottom line. She had shaken their empire to its foundation. The tension in the negotiation room was electric, like a thunderstorm waiting to explode. The long mahogany table separated 2 warring camps. On one side, Natalie Vaughn, composed yet fierce, her binder of evidence now worn at the edges from weeks of gripping it like a lifeline. On the other, Arento Strategies' top legal team, flanked by their PR consultant and a visibly frazzled HR director. At the head of the table sat a stone-faced liaison from the Department of Justice, silent but ever watchful. His presence was a reminder that this was no longer just a private dispute, it was a national reckoning. "We're offering a full settlement," said Diane Keller, the lead attorney for Arento, her voice flat and professional, though her eyes flickered with urgency. Back pay, damages, legal costs, 7 figures, in exchange for a mutual non-disclosure agreement. The withdrawal of all public claims and no admission of wrongdoing by Arento Strategies. Natalie didn't move. She didn't even blink. She had anticipated this. Money wrapped in silence, a golden gag order. Travis Monroe shifted slightly beside her, his hand resting calmly on the binder. "And the reforms?" he asked coolly. Keller cleared her throat. "Voluntary internal review, DI training. We will consider a public statement expressing regret." Regret? Natalie's jaw tightened. "Regret for what exactly?" she asked, her voice even but sharp enough to draw blood. "For firing me when I uncovered racial profiling in your client campaigns? For blacklisting me in the industry? Or for getting caught?" The air thickened. One of the PR consultants began scribbling notes furiously. "We understand this has been emotional," Keller said, attempting diplomacy. "But this offer is more than fair. You could move on, protect your daughter's future, start fresh." That word, "move on," landed like a slap. Natalie felt the rage simmer beneath her ribs. Move on from what? From the humiliation, the sleepless nights, from the idea that speaking truth to power was somehow a liability. She looked at the DOJ liaison. Would a private settlement affect any pending investigations? He shook his head. "Not necessarily, but the weight your public stance carries right now, it's influencing real policy discussions and real people." Natalie's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She thought of Maya, of the life they had pieced together from the rubble of corporate betrayal. She thought of Sabrina Navarro, risking everything to speak up. And she thought of the thousands watching, those who had been passed over, silenced, gaslit, erased. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Keller. "Here's what I want," she said, her voice steady. "Binding structural reforms, third-party audits, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, quarterly oversight reports submitted to the DOJ.
No vague regrets, no verit truths punto."
Keller opened her mouth, but Natalie didn't let her speak. "Or I walk back into that courtroom tomorrow, and we take this all the way. And this time I won't be walking out." A beat of silence. Then Keller nodded slowly. "We'll go back to the board." Natalie leaned back. She'd made her choice. Justice, not hush money. Change, not comfort. And now the clock was ticking for everyone. The courthouse had begun to quiet for the evening. The echo of footsteps faded into silence, and the marble floors, now mostly cleared of the day's traffic, reflected the last golden streaks of sunlight spilling through the tall windows. Natalie Vaughn stood near the vending machines outside courtroom 4B, her binder tucked under her arm. Her body still vibrated with the tension of everything that had transpired. She had just walked out of a negotiation room where she refused to be bought into silence. Now she waited, uncertain of what would come next. That's when she saw him, Sergeant Damon Whitmore, no longer in his stiff patrol stance, but walking toward her without the practiced authority she had grown used to. His uniform jacket was unbuttoned, his expression unsure, his usual presence subdued. For a long moment, he simply stood across from her, as if unsure whether he even had the right to speak. "I heard about the settlement meeting," he said finally, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Word spreads fast around here." Natalie raised an eyebrow, cautious but composed. "Did you come to deliver more instructions, Sergeant?" He shook his head.
No.
"I came to say I'm sorry." That caught her off guard, not because she didn't think he was capable of remorse, but because she hadn't expected it to come so soon or at all. "I followed orders," he continued, looking down briefly. "That's what I kept telling myself. The judge said, 'Remove you,' and I did. But I've replayed that moment over and over. And I realized something. I didn't question why. I just acted. I treated you like a problem instead of a person." Natalie didn't speak right away. The hallway hummed with a distant HVAC drone and the fading click of a typewriter in some clerk's office. She studied him, this man who had dragged her from her own hearing without asking why she was fighting so hard to stay. Now he stood before her, not as an enforcer, but as a man caught in the slow burn of his own awakening. "I don't need your apology," she said finally, her voice level. "But I appreciate it." He nodded slowly. "I'm not proud of how I handled it. You didn't deserve that. And I want you to know I've asked for a transfer." Natalie's brow furrowed. "To where?" "The Community Outreach Division," he replied. "Somewhere I might actually listen instead of just react." A long silence stretched between them, thick with what wasn't said. How many women like her had been silenced by men like him, not out of malice, but out of unchallenged loyalty to power? "I hope you mean that," she said. "I do," he said, his voice steady now. "You made me think. You made this whole place think." As he turned to leave, Natalie stood a little taller. Maybe this wasn't closure, but it was something. Not all apologies undo the past, but sometimes they crack the door open to something better. The morning of the final hearing dawned, gray and heavy, as if the city itself held its breath. Natalie Vaughn stood once again on the courthouse steps. But this time, she didn't feel like the same woman who had walked them weeks ago, battered by doubt, gripping her binder like armor. Today, the binder was gone, replaced by a sleek folder containing the historic settlement agreement, a document that bore her name alongside sweeping commitments to corporate reform, oversight, and public accountability. Behind her, a modest group of supporters and media lingered. Their signs were less urgent now, but still proud. "We believe Natalie. Truth is power." Somewhere in that crowd, her daughter Maya watched quietly, camera in hand, recording a moment she'd never forget. Inside courtroom 4B, the mood was nothing like before. The tension had faded, giving way to an unusual calm, the eye of a storm after its destruction. Judge Margot Sinclair entered with her usual severity, but her robe seemed less imposing, her gaze more measured. This was no longer a contest of wills, but an official conclusion, a record of what had changed. Natalie took her seat beside Travis Monroe, who gave her a quiet nod of solidarity as they waited for the judge to speak. "The matter of Vaughn versus Arento Strategies has reached a negotiated resolution," Sinclair began, her gavel resting lightly in her palm. "We are here to enter the terms of the agreement into the official record and to confirm that both parties accept the outcome in good faith." The lead counsel for Arento stood and confirmed the settlement. He looked drained, as though the weeks of public scrutiny and legal fallout had aged him. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by the careful deference of someone who had been forced to listen, for once. Then the judge turned to Natalie. "Ms. Vaughn, do you believe this agreement adequately addresses your claims and concerns?" The room held its breath. Natalie stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. When her voice came, it was clear and firm. "I do, Your Honor," she said. "This agreement isn't just for me. It's for everyone who has been overlooked, silenced, or told their experiences didn't matter. These reforms are just a beginning, not an end. But I believe we've taken the first real step toward something better." Judge Sinclair gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, her gavel striking once with finality. "Then it is so ordered." The courtroom exhaled. It was done. As reporters rushed outside for statements, Natalie remained still for a moment, savoring the silence. She had been dismissed, humiliated, removed, but now her voice had been etched into the public record, an echo no system could bury. And as she stepped into the sunlight, Maya rushed forward, throwing her arms around her mother. "You didn't just win, Mom," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "You changed everything." Natalie smiled, her eyes shimmering. Not everything, but enough to make the next fight easier. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Weeks had passed since the gavel fell in courtroom 4B, but the aftershocks of Natalie Vaughn's case continued to ripple outward, unexpected, unstoppable, and far-reaching. What had begun as a single woman's fight for justice had grown into a movement. The settlement, now public record, had become a touchstone for conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms alike. Arento Strategies, once an untouchable powerhouse of political influence, had been thrust into a new era, not of reinvention, but reckoning. Shareholders demanded oversight, clients terminated contracts, and the promised reforms, quarterly diversity audits, third-party compliance reviews, and the appointment of an ethics officer, were already underway. The old regime, once smug and dismissive, had been forced into transparency. But the most powerful change was quieter, more human. Natalie began receiving emails from strangers across the country. Women who had been pushed out, ignored, or punished for speaking up. Men who had witnessed injustice and stayed silent, now asking how they could help. A high school student in Chicago wrote, "I didn't know someone like me could change something so big. Thank you." Natalie saved each message in a folder she called Echoes. Social media still buzzed with the hashtag Von Verdict, now synonymous with corporate accountability and courage under pressure. One viral video showed Maya standing proudly beside her mother outside the courthouse, telling a reporter she didn't just win her case, she made them listen. It had over 1 million views. Natalie declined most interviews, preferring to let her actions and the reforms speak. But behind the scenes, she was already building something new. With Travis Monroe's guidance, she launched an initiative, the Vaughn Project, a nonprofit offering legal resources, workplace advocacy training, and whistleblower protections for underrepresented professionals in high-risk industries. Former Arento intern Sabrina Navarro, now hailed as a modern-day hero, joined as the organization's first director of integrity. She worked remotely and anonymously for her safety but poured her energy into systemic change. Even the courthouse felt different. A new set of judicial guidelines regarding courtroom removals and racial bias in legal proceedings was quietly implemented, spearheaded in part by none other than Sergeant Damon Whitmore. Having transferred to the courthouse's newly formed Community Relations Unit, he now trained new officers on the importance of discretion, equity, and the human cost of blind compliance. No longer hiding behind protocol, he had chosen to do the harder thing: learn, change, and act. One rainy afternoon, Natalie sat at her kitchen table sorting through a fresh stack of letters, thank yous, media requests, and even a commendation from the Department of Justice for her role in exposing discriminatory practices. Maya, now home from school, curled beside her on the couch, reading a textbook on civil rights history. "Mom," she asked suddenly, "do you think this is what Grandma would have wanted?" Natalie smiled softly, eyes wet but steady. "I think it's what she started. I just picked up the thread." Outside, the rain broke just enough for a ray of sunlight to pierce through. As Natalie stood by the window, watching the droplets glisten on the glass, she felt it. Not the end of a battle, but the beginning of a legacy. The ripples had only just begun. In today's world, where systemic inequality and workplace discrimination still persist behind polished walls and corporate statements, Natalie Vaughn's story feels strikingly relevant. Many individuals, especially women, people of color, and whistleblowers, are silenced. Not through threats, but through policies, power plays, and quiet retaliation. Natalie's refusal to back down, even when humiliated and dismissed, mirrors the bravery required of anyone who dares to confront injustice from within. Her fight reminds us that true progress isn't achieved through silence or settlement alone, but through accountability, reform, and relentless truth-telling. The lesson we can take from Natalie's journey is this: standing up for what's right may come at a cost, but staying silent often costs even more. Change doesn't begin with applause. It begins with resistance. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be erased. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.